Southern Korea as it was, a half-forgotten corner of Asia that had just found peace and independence after 35 years. Annexed by Japan in 1910, the ancient kingdom had been turned into a colony, its people harnessed to feed and supply the Japanese war machine. When liberation came in 1945, the people of South Korea asked only the right and the means to work for themselves at last. It was a simple ambition, a determination to maintain living standards and, where possible, to raise them still further. The young Republic of Korea went to work with a will. Textile mills turned from tropical uniforms to shirts and blouses that Asia's people were clamoring to buy after years of deprivation. Industry began producing for Korean homes. Training schools began turning out the skilled mechanics on which prosperous industries depend. New techniques were being taught to more Koreans than ever before. Backing this recovery effort came millions of dollars of martial aid. Cotton for the textile factories, flour for the bakeries, and rice to feed the workers until Korean farms could return to full production. But peace had left a divided Korea. The northern half was under communist control. As the South Koreans went to work, even as they voted freely for the first time in their history, Soviet policymakers to the north were planning to halt these first decisive steps towards democracy. Communist rulers above the 38th parallel were ordered to attack the young republic. North Korean films, the free world was never meant to see, document a crime of war. War made in the Kremlin with Soviet tanks, Soviet guns, Soviet shells. Invasion, just 7 days after the announcement that more than half of North Korea's people had signed the Stockholm Peace Appeal. The weight of a long-planned attack immediately forced back the lightly armed troops of South Korea. In their wake, as always, came the helpless refugees. In a few weeks, South Korea's hopes for peace and prosperity had collapsed in devastation and death. But the people of South Korea began mobilizing to meet the vicious attack from the north. Women volunteered to spare men for the front. At Lake Success, the Security Council took immediate action. North Korea was branded an aggressor, and 53 of the United Nations backed the Council's decision. Unprepared for war, the free nations had few trained fighting men and little heavy equipment ready, but all they could gather was rushed thousands of miles. Gradually, the free people of the world built up the first United Nations fighting force in history. Men and equipment rushed forward as fast as they landed, stopped the communist-led Koreans, counterattacked, and finally drove the aggressor back over the 38th parallel. At last, the free world had set a limit to the Kremlin's timetable of armed imperialism. But even as war raged on, the Republic of Korea's government in recaptured Seoul was facing the challenge of rehabilitation, aided by UN and Marshall Plan experts. In the wake of the armies, these men went to work ensuring that goods and transport were in the right spot at the right time. They set out to check on the needs of a broken economy. Communications were a top priority. Working in cooperation with military engineers, telegraph and phone systems were hurriedly improvised. As soon as skeleton communications were back in operation, volunteer labor squads, ready to clear away the debris of war, were able to work where their efforts could do most good. Steel rails brought by the Marshall Plan from Japan were rushed into use. To see for themselves the size of the task ahead, Marshall Plan officials, led by Administrator Foster, flew to Korea. A few weeks after their visit, a battlefield had been turned into a brand new railroad yard, ready once more to serve the peaceful purposes of Korea's people. The new railroad system, emergency marshal aid, and the work of a few experts gave Korea's economy the jolt it needed. Rice and fuel, the fundamentals of human survival in Korea, reappeared in the markets, bringing a brief respite from the daily struggle for existence. But this was only the start of the fight for life behind the lines. If there was to be rice and heat and work tomorrow, no time was to be lost. Hillsides everywhere, stripped of trees, typified a country whose natural resources were being rapidly exhausted. Trees were being cut for fuel faster than new forests could be planted. To save the trees that were left, an American forestry expert started to get the peat industry back on its feet. As United Nations jet planes took off in battle procession, peat was cut and stacked for drying and distribution to keep the Korean people warm. Meanwhile, Marshall Aid was helping directly too. Coal for local industries. Kerosene oil that Korea's people use for lighting. Cement for reconstruction tasks. Simple things like cotton for bandages and fibers that the Korean people could make into rope or knit into nets. New ropes and new nets meant fish, a big item in Korean housekeeping. And the return to sea of Busan's fishing fleet, led by a modern radar vessel. Even a United States Navy power station was towed across the Pacific to pour light and power into reviving Korean utilities and industries. South Korea was once again a going concern. Communism does not spare its victims so easily. In Peking, the Kremlin representatives were planning to snatch back the victory they had thought was theirs. They were not prepared to let Korea patch her wounds in peace and security. Summoning the strength of half a continent, the vast resources and manpower of China were now flung into the peninsula to give Korea her second bloodletting. This time, the aim was to outnumber the men of the United Nations, regardless of Chinese losses, regardless of Korean misery. many terrible months later, the day of final reconstruction is near. The day when men and women freed from the anxieties of war can once more plan their own tomorrows. That is why the men of the United Nations have been fighting so long and so hard to stop communist aggression in its tracks, and thus to restore to Korea's people, once and for all, the right to carry out unhindered, bold new projects of peace. The lesson from Korea is the lesson of united action. Together, the free world has learnt that to build a society in which men can progress and live their own lives without fear and without interference, it must be built, and if necessary, defended by nations united.